Case 1. Basid McLean. When a mother of 3 vanished from her apartment in the South Bronx, her own son, who walked into the police station to report her missing, he told the rest of the family that she had last been seen climbing into a car for a ride to work. And so they searched, and they called around, they waited. What none of them understood in those first frantic days was that the person guiding them to look for her was the one person who already knew exactly where she was. The discovery, when it finally came, would be almost too much for any family to survive. The son was Basid McLean. He was 23 years old, born in 1989, and he had lived a hard and unstable life post. He spent much of his childhood in foster care while his mother struggled with addiction, and by his own account he carried a deep resentment about that separation even after the two of them reconciled when he was 18. By the time of the killing, he had been arrested 21 times. Years earlier, he had been placed on probation after an assault on 2 police officers, an incident that had also landed him time on Rikers Island. He had been diagnosed with serious mental illness, including schizophrenia, and he had cycled through psychiatric care going back to his childhood. He was supposed to be taking medication every single day. By the accounts given at his trial, in the period that mattered most, he was not. His mother was Tanya Bird. She was 45 years old, a home health aide, a woman who spent her working life caring for other people. She had 3 children, including a grown daughter, and a 7-year-old son named Nasir, who has Down syndrome. People who knew Tanya described her as endlessly giving, the kind of woman who would hand you whatever you needed without being asked. Her own sister would later say she simply wanted the world to know that Tanya had been a good mother, that she had always taken care of her son, even the son who would end her life. There were quiet signs of how frightened Tanya had become of him. She had grown afraid of his temper, and she suspected he had been mistreating little Nasir. She had reason to be afraid. A friend of the family would remember her as the kind of woman who would hand you whatever you needed before you even thought to ask for it. Her own sister wanted only one thing understood when it was all over, that whatever else this story turned into, Tanya had been a good mother, a woman who had always taken care of her children, including the very child who would one day end her life. What happened in late February of 2013 began with a domestic argument inside the apartment. Tanya told Basid he was a bad father and ordered him out. He killed her. What he did afterward inside that apartment is the part of this account that will not be described, except to say that it was so monstrous it would make this one of the most infamous cases the Bronx had seen in years. Her remains were later recovered from several different locations within a short walk of the building. He even captured the aftermath in a single photograph that would, in time, spread across the internet and brand the case forever. That image is not something this account will describe either. It is enough to know that it existed, that the medical examiner would later use it as evidence against him. Then, having done all of that, Basid walked into the local precinct and filed a missing person report for the mother he had just killed. He scrubbed the apartment with bleach until the smell of it hung in the air. He even pulled in a friend, a 26-year-old named William Harris, to help carry bags out of the building, telling him only that the bags held nothing but household waste. For a brief window, the lie held. On paper, he was a worried son, helping detectives search for his missing mother. It came apart the very next day, and it came apart from 3 directions at once. A passerby walking a dog discovered the first bag, which led police to the rest. Officers, following up on Basid's own missing person report, walked into the apartment and were met immediately by the overpowering smell of bleach. Pond, and inside they found the items he had bought to do what he did, along with the latex gloves and the shopping cart he had used to move everything. Then there was the technology in his own pocket. The building's cameras had recorded him hauling bags out into the night, and the medical examiner matched the photograph on his phone directly to the case. The web of evidence closed around him within roughly a day. Bassett and Harris were taken into custody at the precinct. And inside the interrogation rooms, the two of them turned on each other, each one trying to push the blame onto the other. The people who built the case were detectives working alongside the investigators of the Bronx District Attorney's Office, and the thread that mattered most was the most modern one of all. It was not a witness who sealed his fate, and in the end it was not even his own shifting story. It was the building's cameras, which had silently recorded him carrying his terrible burden out into the dark, and the single image he had chosen to keep on his own phone, which the medical examiner was able to tie directly back to the woman he had walked into a precinct and reported missing. By the time he was brought out for his arraignment, his condition had visibly come apart, and that unravelling would become the seed of the only argument his defence had left to make. For the family, there was no single clean moment of discovery, only a slow and unbearable understanding. One sister had spoken to Bassett by phone after Tanya was reported missing, and he had calmly told her their mother had last been seen accepting a ride to work. Another sister, Porsche, came to the precinct and stood in front of her brother, and she would later describe how he looked her directly in the eyes and insisted he had done nothing wrong even then. She said she no longer knew who he was. By the time he was arraigned, Bassett was visibly unravelling, state so deteriorated that it only sharpened the question that would come to define his entire trial, the question of whether the man in that courtroom had truly understood, on the day it happened, what he was doing. It is a question that haunts cases like this one, because it forces a family to argue, in public, about how much of the person they lost was ever really there at all. That question was the whole fight. The case went to the Bronx Supreme Court, and the defence argued that Bassett was legally insane, that his severe mental illness meant he could not grasp that what he was doing was wrong. His lawyer even pointed to that infamous photograph as proof of a mind too detached from reality to know better, asking the jury whether it looked like the work of someone who understood right from wrong. The prosecution, led by a senior figure in the office's domestic violence unit, argued the opposite, kept steering the jury's attention to the days around the killing rather than the years before it. A man who did not understand his own actions, the argument went, does not buy supplies, does not scrub a scene with bleach, does not file a false report about the very person he has harmed, and does not recruit a friend to carry the evidence out under the cover of an everyday errand. Those were not the acts of confusion, they were the acts of concealment. In the fall of 2016, the jury rejected the insanity defence and found him guilty of second-degree murder, unlawful dissection of a human body, and assault. His friend Harris faced a lesser charge of hindering the prosecution and ultimately served his time and was released. For Tanya, the distinction the jury drew between confusion and concealment was the whole of the justice available, the legal system's way of saying that her death had been a choice and not the accident of a broken mind. On the 5th of December 2016, Bassett McLean was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, with additional time stacked on for the dissection count. Court issued a 100-year order, keeping him away from Harris. He will not be eligible to even ask for release until around the year 2039. He is held in a maximum security prison in upstate New York, and within a year of his sentencing he had been charged again this time for assaulting a corrections officer behind those walls. The sentencing was where the family finally spoke. What they said reached far deeper than any verdict could. One of Tanya's sisters stood and told Basid that this was goodbye. The family who had loved him without condition was closing the door for good. That this would be the last time any of them would lay eyes on him. Another sister asked him the only question of grief that Raw knows how to ask. Why he had taken away their mother. And their grandfather, a man of 75, told Basid that he had been the one who taught him to walk when he was a small boy, and that what he had done had broken his heart. These were not strangers describing a monster they had read about. They were a family describing one of their own, standing in a courtroom to say farewell to a son and a grandson, and a brother in the same breath that they grieved the woman he had killed. The aftermath of this case reached even further into tragedy. About a month after the sentencing, Basid's own young son, only 4 years old, was beaten to death by others in a separate and unrelated case. Second devastation layered onto a family that had already lost so much. Little Nasser, a boy with Down syndrome, who had been inside that apartment during the chaos, was never the one who found his mother. He was simply a child in a home where the unthinkable happened, and he was carried to safety by the aunt who took him in and raised him. The same aunt who would stand in that courtroom and tell Basid that the family who had loved him without condition was saying goodbye for the last time. Tonya Bird had spent her life caring for other people, and in the end it was that same family, the one she built, was left to carry the weight of how she was taken. The next case crosses an ocean to a quiet town in Sweden and to a young girl who would not learn the truth about her father for years until she stumbled across a single word in a newspaper that she did not even understand. Case 2. Isaacin Johnson. She was 9 years old when her father killed the woman she had come to think of as a second mother. The adults around her tried to soften it. The story was everywhere, splashed across newspapers under a single brutal word. She came across those headlines herself, and she did not even understand the word that had branded the case. It was only as she got older, around the age of 13, reading articles about her own father, that she finally grasped what that word truly meant, and what it meant for the woman who had helped raise her. Father was a Swedish man, born in 1978, who at the time of the crime went by the name Isaacin Johnson, though he would later legally change his surname to a Swedish word that means afflicted. He was 32 when it happened, and he carried a long and serious psychiatric history. He met a woman named Helle Christensen in 2009 when the two of them were patients at the same psychiatric clinic. He already had a daughter from an earlier relationship, a little girl born in 2001, who is known publicly only by a chosen name, Jamie Lee, used to protect her identity. Helle Christensen was 40 years old and a mother herself. She met Johnson at that clinic, and the two of them began planning a life together, hoping to move into his mother's apartment in the town of Skara and open a tattoo and piercing shop. Helle grew close to his daughter, and the little girl came to call her a second mother. But the relationship was not the fresh start it looked like from the outside. Helle's own sister later told Swedish media that Johnson had a violent temper, recalling a time Helle had turned up with a leg broken in 3 separate places. The most chilling record of what was really happening came from Helle herself. After her death, her diary was recovered. Pages told the story of a woman growing more frightened by the day. She wrote about him, talking constantly of punishments, of evil. She wrote that she could endure it because she loved him. In the weeks before her death, she quietly approached a local librarian and asked for help finding a hostel, somewhere she could escape to She begged the woman not to involve the police. And there is a detail from that final stretch that is almost unbearable to sit with. On what turned out to be Jamie Lee's last visit, Hel cooked the girl a meal. And as she set the plate down in front of her, she told the child to enjoy it. Because it would be the last thing she would ever make for her. Because her father was going to kill her. That memory is Jamie Lee's own, recalled years later as a recounted moment rather than anything written down at the time. It was the last warning from a woman who already seemed to know exactly what was coming for her. Whether those exact words were spoken that night or reassembled later, by a grieving daughter trying to make sense of the unmakeable, fear underneath them was real. And it matched everything the diary had already confessed in private. Behold, Hele had run out of people to tell and places to turn, and the one person she could not protect was the little girl across the table. On the 12th of November 2010, in that apartment in Skara, Johnson killed Hel Christensen. The way he did it, and what he did afterward, is the source of the grim nickname the case is still known by across Sweden. And it is not something this account is going to describe. The details are among the most disturbing in modern Swedish crime, and naming them adds nothing here that the simple, terrible fact does not already carry. Police were alerted quickly, and they found Hele in the apartment. Johnson did not run. He was arrested at the scene, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. There was a terrible ordinariness to the hours that led up to it. The two of them had woken late, gone out to shop, moved through the small errands of any couple sharing a home, and then the day curdled into something no one who knew Hele could have braced for. The prosecutor, who handled the case, laid it all out in a Swedish courtroom the following year, and there was never any real doubt about who had done it. The only question Swedish law had left to answer was what kind of place a man like this belonged in. The investigation did not have to work hard to establish what kind of relationship this had been. Hele's diary spoke for her, page after page of a woman trying to talk herself into surviving. The librarian came forward with the account of a frightened woman quietly asking for an escape route. Social services records documented a couple who had been applying for grants and navigating real hardship together. All of it corroborated a pattern of fear and control that had been building for more than a year. Plain view of a system that never managed to pull Hele out of it in time. That phrase, in plain view, is the part that lingers. A librarian had heard her ask for an escape route. Caseworkers had handled her paperwork. Her own diary was a running record of a woman rehearsing her survival and losing the argument a little more each day. The warning signs were not hidden away in some private darkness. They were scattered across the ordinary institutions that touch a person's life, and not one of them moved fast enough or saw clearly enough to stand between Hel and the man she had quietly told a librarian she needed to flee. 2011. Johnson was tried in Sweden and convicted of murder. The court determined that he should not go to an ordinary prison, but instead be committed to closed forensic psychiatric care. The path Swedish law takes for offenders found to be driven by serious mental illness. He was sent to a secure regional hospital, and what happened in the years that followed caused real public anger in Sweden, because to many people it felt like an insult to the woman he had killed. From inside that institution, he became engaged to another patient who had a violent past of her own, and the two of them turned their notoriety into a kind of grim performance, posting online about what they had done, until the spectacle reached the floor of the Swedish parliament, where lawmakers moved to restrict internet access for patients held in secure psychiatric care. He found ways to profit from the horror too, putting disturbing objects connected to his case up for sale from behind the walls. that were supposed to be holding him. Time he was granted more and more freedom. Brief escorted furloughs that grew longer and more frequent. By recent reporting, he had moved into a form of open or outpatient care. Each new headline reopened the wound for everyone who had ever loved Helly. And there were many of them, because the man at the centre of those headlines kept finding ways to stay in the news, long after the case that had put him away faded for everyone else. But this case earns its place on this list because of his daughter and the way the truth reached her. She did not find a body. She was 9, and the adults around her tried to spare her the worst of it, but the story was far too large to contain, carried in newspapers under a single word that became the name of the case. She came across those headlines herself, as a young child, without fully understanding them. It was only as she grew older, around 13, reading the articles about her own father, that she came to understand what that word described, and what it had meant for the woman who had been a second mother to her. Think for a moment about what that discovery actually was. There was no gentle conversation, no careful breaking of the news, no hand on the shoulder. There was a child piecing together the worst thing imaginable about her own father. From the cold language of newspaper reports written for strangers, headlines built around a word she was far too young to understand. What no one could do was control how she learned the truth. Press told it in the most brutal way there is. She has said that she cried until she could not cry anymore, and then went strangely cold, numb, watching her own life from somewhere outside of it. A numbness thus that frightened her more than the grief did. She has said she went into a kind of denial almost at once, a cold that settled over her so completely that she did not recognize the girl staring back from the mirror, and she believes that numbness was the only way her mind could find to shield her from a truth that size. She was a child who had loved a woman as a second mother, and she learned how that woman died not from anyone who loved her, from a search engine, and a stack of articles written for an audience of strangers who would never know her name. What she did with that inheritance is the reason her name belongs here alongside the others. She has built a public life out of refusing to let this define her. She wrote a memoir whose title translates, plainly and painfully, to the daughter of the man behind that nickname, and an English-language edition followed. She sat for a documentary built around interviews with her father, watched him on a screen, tried to reconcile that face with the one she remembered. She has appeared on morning television and on podcasts, speaking about resilience and mental health. And she now lives part of her life abroad, raising her own 2 children far from the town where it happened. The blogging her father had done from inside that hospital, strange notoriety he and another patient had tried to build out of their crimes, had once been disturbing enough to reach the floor of the Swedish parliament. His daughter answered all of that noise with something far quieter and far more durable. Put the name she chose to face the world with on the story instead, and refused to let it belong only to him, where the system had handed him freedom and a platform. She took the harder road of telling the truth in her own voice, and in doing so she turned a word meant to brand a killer into the title of a survivor's story. What makes her case sit so heavily is that the binding thread here is stretched into its strangest and cruelest shape. She did not walk into a room and find a body. She found the truth, the way the rest of the world found it. In print, piece of public horror she happened to be related to. The next case stays with that same unthinkable idea. A parent as the source of the horror, but this time there were 2 parents acting together, and the children they destroyed were their own. If you are the kind of person who has to know how a story like this ends, take a second and subscribe. It is free, and it is the only reason cases like these keep getting told. Case 3, Maurice Taylor Sr., call that finally brought help to the house, was not about a murder. It was about a possible gas leak. Man who took online fitness classes had grown worried when his trainer suddenly went silent and stopped sending the links to log on. And he phoned for someone to go check on the family, mentioning that there were 4 children inside, and that he was afraid for their safety. When firefighters finally entered that home in the high desert north of Los Angeles, what they found had nothing to do with gas. 2 small children who had survived had been living in the middle of it for days. The trainer was Maurice Taylor Sr., born in 1986, 34 years old. A former personal trainer who had moved his sessions online during the pandemic, coaching clients through a screen from inside the very home where all of this would happen. His wife was Natalie Brothwell, 43 years old. 2 were married and were the parents of 4 children, and from the outside there had been nothing to mark them as a family standing at the edge. Catastrophe. He had been coaching clients through a screen from inside that very house, his voice carrying workout counts and easy encouragement to strangers logging on from their own living rooms. Small, ordinary business, running right up until the week. Everything behind those walls came apart. In the days right after Thanksgiving in 2020, in their home in Lancaster, California, they turned on that family. The victims were their 2 older children, a daughter just 13 years old, a son only 12. On the 29th of November 2020, inside the family home, both parents killed both of those children. What was done to those 2 children is not something this account will describe. Hot. They were with the 2 people who should have kept them safest in all the world. And that is the heart of why this case is so impossible to absorb. Bodies were left in separate bedrooms of the home. The charges that would one day be read aloud in a courtroom told the shape of it without any detail. 2 counts of first-degree murder, with the special finding that more than one person had been killed, the kind of allegation that exists only for the rarest and worst cases a county ever sees. Then came the part that sets this case apart even from the others around it on this list. The 2 surviving sons, boys of 8 and 9, forced by their own parents to look at what had been done to their brother and sister. They were made to see the aftermath, and then they were confined to their bedrooms for days without food, trapped inside a home that had become a crime scene, the very people who had created it. According to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, that is exactly what happened. 2 little boys became the household witnesses to something no child should ever see, and they were kept there, hungry and terrified, for the better part of a week. Try to hold that in your mind for a moment, because it is the detail that sets this case apart from almost every other one. The cruelty was not only in what the 2 parents did to the older children, it was in what they then forced the younger 2 to carry, on purpose, by making them look and then locking them in with the knowledge. Whatever was broken in the adults at the centre of this, it was not the kind of breakage that explains itself, and no court would ever find a reason that fit. The discovery itself hinged on something almost unbearably mundane. One of Taylor's online fitness clients, an attorney, noticed that the session links had simply stopped coming, and the silence gnawed at him until he picked up the phone and described his fear to a dispatcher, framing it as a possible gas leak, and stressing that there were children inside who might be in danger. At least one other client called the sheriff. A neighbour had already noticed a smell coming from the property, so when the county fire crews rolled up that morning, a little before 8, They came expecting a hazard they could vent and clear, and instead they walked into the worst thing any of them had ever encountered. The two children in two separate bedrooms, injuries investigators would describe only as some form of sharp trauma. They did not say more in public, and there is no need to, because the manner of it changes nothing about the weight of it. They handed the scene to the sheriff's department out of the local Lancaster station. Taylor was still inside with his two surviving sons, and deputies took him into custody right there, removing him from the house by force, some accounts describing him strapped to a stretcher. His bail was first set at $2 million, and then pushed far higher as the full scope case came into focus. His wife was already gone. For the firefighters and deputies who walked in that morning expecting nothing worse than a gas line, the discovery was the kind that does not leave a person. They had come to vent a house and clear a hazard. They left as witnesses to the aftermath of something that had been sitting inside those walls for 5 days, while the world outside went on, assuming the family was simply quiet, busy, keeping to themselves, the way so many households did that strange and isolated year. The two surviving boys were found malnourished and confined, and they were taken into protective custody, alive but carrying a weight that is difficult to even contemplate. Natalie Brothwell, who had fled, tracked to Tucson, Arizona, where she was arrested at her residence the following September, and extradited back to Los Angeles County the month after. From there, the case crawled forward across years, working its way slowly toward a trial. Roused, much of what prosecutors would eventually prove came not from a courtroom confrontation, but from the careful work of forensic interviewers, gathered the accounts of the surviving children gently, away from the witness stand, so that the two traumatized boys would never have to relive it in front of a jury. It was a rare mercy in a case almost empty of them, the system, bending its usual demand for live testimony so that two children would not have to stand in a room and describe the worst thing that had ever happened to them. The simple fact that the parents had confined those child witnesses for days, alongside the evidence of what they had done, told much of the story on its own. The case did not move quickly. There were questions raised early about whether the father was even mentally fit to stand trial, and only after he was found competent could the matter inch forward. He made one bid to represent himself, which the court declined to let derail the proceedings. The team that prosecuted came out of the county district attorney's office, and the long years of delay meant that by the time a jury finally heard all of it, the two surviving boys had grown from small children into teenagers, still waiting, still in the care of people who were not their parents. After the arrest, the case briefly stalled when the court raised a question about whether Taylor was even mentally fit to stand trial. He was eventually found competent. At one stage, he tried to represent himself, citing reasons he framed as spiritual move. The court did not allow to derail the proceedings, and his attorney would later raise his mental state before the jury as well. None of it landed. The prosecution was led by the county's district attorney's office, and the district attorney himself spoke publicly about a crime he struggled to find words for. On the 18th of November 2025, courthouse that serves the high desert communities north of the city, jury convicted both Maurice Taylor Sr. and Natalie Brothwell of 2 counts of first-degree murder, with the special finding that there had been multiple murders, along with 2 counts of child abuse, under conditions likely to cause great harm or death. Charges that spoke directly to what the surviving boys had been put through. Then on the 2nd of February 2026 came the sentencing, and with it a moment that left the courtroom cold. Brothwell spoke, insisting that she had not killed her children and claiming she had tried to save them. The judge rejected that account flatly, pointing to her silence in all the places where a mother fighting for her children would have spoken, and to the absence of anything resembling genuine remorse. She condemned in particular the cruelty of forcing the surviving boys to look at the aftermath. Both parents were sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of life with no possibility of parole, extra years stacked on for what the surviving boys endured, and a protective order was issued meant to keep both of them away from those children for the next decade. The district attorney called it a monstrous act of cruelty that had shattered an entire family. Parents were sent into the state prison system, and the court issued an order meant to keep them away from their surviving sons for the next 10 years. A piece of paper standing in for a protection those boys should never have needed from the 2 people who made them, will spend the rest of their lives in custody, and neither will ever again be in any position to reach the children who outlived that house. In the chaotic early days before the courts had done their slow work, even the city's mayor had reached for words like brutal and wondered aloud whether the strange pressures of that lockdown year had pushed the household over some edge. But no such explanation was ever proven. There was no cult, no manifesto, no motive a jury could point to. There were only 2 parents who destroyed their own children and forced 2 more to witness it, and then locked those survivors away with the memory. The 2 boys who lived are teenagers now, growing up somewhere safe and far away, raised by people who are not the people who were supposed to raise them, carrying a horror that was put into them on purpose. There is no version of growing up that fully absorbs a thing like that. There is only the long work of living alongside it, which is the work those 2 boys were handed before either of them had turned 10. The court that finally heard the case described a family shattered, but that word almost undersells it. A family implies something that was whole and then broke. What the evidence described was 2 adults who turned the safest place those children had, their own home, into the single most dangerous place any of them would ever stand. The next case moves from the privacy of a home to the middle of a public street in broad daylight, where 2 little girls listened from inside their apartment as their mother was killed just outside the door. Case 4. Jose Solano Landaeta. It happened in the late morning, on an ordinary residential street, in front of people who were walking home from brunch. A mother of 2 ran for her life down the sidewalk, in nothing but slippers, and she did not make it. Her 2 daughters, one of them a young girl, and one of them barely more than a baby, were just inside the apartment a few steps away. They did not see it happen. They heard enough. And within minutes, a single line crackled across the sheriff's radio that captured the whole horror in one sentence. Children were there, it said. They were scared to come out. They wanted their mom. The man who took their mother was Jose Solano Landaeta, 33 years old, who went by the name Rafa. He had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and prescribed an antipsychotic medication, and by the accounts at trial, he was off that medication and drinking. Years earlier, he had been convicted of a serious crime against an unconscious teenage girl. He was the father of the victim's youngest daughter, which kept him tethered to her life, even as she tried to pull away. And he was already the subject of a restraining order that she had taken out against him months before for domestic abuse. That order was meant to be a wall. On paper it told him to stay away, told the world she had named him as a danger, created the kind of record that is supposed to make a man think twice. It is worth holding on to that fact as the rest of this unfolds, because Karina did not miss the warning signs. She saw them clearly, she believed them, and she went to a courthouse and did exactly what people in her position are told to do. The victim was Karina Castro. She was 27 years old, and she had built the ordinary, hard-working life of a young single mother. She had finished her high school equivalency. She delivered food to make her income stretch, and she was raising 2 little girls. The younger only about a year and a half old, and the older still a small child. She had also done the thing that domestic violence advocates beg people in her situation to do. Earlier that year, she had gone to the courts and taken out a restraining order against the man who would kill her, documenting the abuse, creating a record, asking the system for protection. In the days before her death, the two of them had been locked in escalating, bitter exchanges over social media. She had threatened to expose his criminal past to the world. He had answered with menacing images, little symbols of a figure swinging a sword. She had taunted him right back, daring him, and in one of those exchanges, Landeeta told her plainly that she now had a target on her back, and that he had already gotten what he called a green light. Post. The exchanges had the awful quality of a countdown that only one of them knew was running. Investigators would later pull those messages through legal demands to the platforms that carried them, and laid side by side, they read less like an argument than like a plan being talked into existence. She was pushing back, daring him, refusing to be frightened into silence. He was rehearsing, and his own messages, stripped of the slang they were written in, read less like the heat of an argument than like a decision he had already made. On the 8th of September 2022, just before noon, outside the apartment building on Laurel Street in San Carlos, California, the two of them argued in the open, watched by 3 friends who happened to be leaving a nearby restaurant. Landeeta walked off to his car, which was parked a couple of blocks away, retrieved a samurai sword, and came back. He chased Karina down the public sidewalk, and he killed her there, in the street, while horrified strangers watched. The exact nature of what he did to her is not something this account will set down. It is enough to say that it happened in the open, front of witnesses in the middle of the day, and that months later, a member of the jury would break down in tears simply at the sight of the photographs from that sidewalk. He did it in the open, on a public street, in the full light of a weekday morning, people he had never met watching and unable to stop it. Then Landeeta walked back to his car, placed the weapon inside, drove away from the scene. But he did not get far, and he did something almost no one expected. He came back, and he brought his own mother with him. A sheriff's deputy detained him, and without being asked anything at all, Landeeta confessed on the spot, saying she had been trying to kill him, and that he was sorry. It was the only explanation he ever volunteered, and it matched nothing about what the witnesses on that sidewalk had just watched happen. The discovery for Karina's family was its own slow agony. 2 girls had been inside the apartment the entire time. They did not witness the killing with their own eyes, something the sheriff's office was careful to confirm afterward. But they heard the commotion just beyond the door, and that radio log entry, timed to 14 minutes past noon, recorded the unbearable reality of 2 small children calling for a mother, who was already gone. They were taken from the apartment by Child Protective Services, along with the family's pets, before Karina's own father could reach the scene. Father, Martin Castro Jr., learned what had happened from the news that evening and rushed to Laurel Street, where he found the fire department washing down the road. When the deputy on scene would not confirm who the victim was, he recognized his daughter's car parked nearby, and only then did the deputy confirm the thing no father should ever have to hear, that it was, indeed, his daughter. There is a cruelty in how that news travelled. The 2 girls had already been taken from the apartment by the time their grandfather arrived, gathered up by Child Protective Services, along with the family's pets, that the man racing toward the scene could not even find the children to hold. He learned that his daughter was gone from a deputy, who would not say her name, Frost. And from the sight of her car parked where she had left it that morning, on a street that was already being washed clean, the case against Landaeta was overwhelming, and it had practically been handed to investigators. There were multiple eyewitnesses who had seen the whole thing. There was the weapon, recovered from his car, Host. There was his own unprompted confession to the deputy, and there were the subpoenaed social media messages, including that chilling note to his friend and the threatening images he had sent Karina herself. Stacked together, they read less like the wreckage of an argument than like a confession written in advance, a man announcing what he intended to do, and then doing it in front of witnesses, court. Appointed doctors examined him and concluded that he had been legally sane at the time of the killing, that finding closed off the one path his defence had seemed ready to take, and left almost nothing standing between him and the verdict that came. His defence had at first signalled it would argue insanity, then abandoned that approach just days before trial, and simply entered a plea of not guilty. By the time the case reached a jury, there was no real defence left to mount, only the grim formality of confirming what a whole sidewalk of strangers had already seen. Landaeta refused to attend the opening statements. He was removed from the stand for refusing to answer questions. He stayed away from the closing arguments entirely, present only to hear the verdict read. On the 20th of November, 2023, jury in San Mateo County convicted Jose Solano Landaeta of first-degree murder with a weapon enhancement, found true the aggravating factors that the killing had been premeditated, that it had been cruel, and that it had been committed against a vulnerable victim. On the 30th of January 2024, the judge sentenced him to 25 years to life for the killing itself, with an additional year added for his use of the weapon, which means he will not even be eligible to ask for parole until 26 years have passed. He had spent much of his own trial, refusing to be part of it, absent for the opening, removed from the stand when he would not answer, gone again for the closing, present in the end, only to hear 12 strangers agree on what the whole street had already seen. 2 girls were eventually placed with Karina's family, who fought through the protective services process to bring them home. At sentencing, their grandmother told the court what the numbers and verdicts never can, that the older girl still wakes in the night, still cries for a mother who is not coming back. The street where it happened became a small shrine, marked with flowers and candles, and the surrounding community gathered money to help raise 2 children who had lost everything in the span of a single morning. The case became a fixture in local efforts to warn others about how quickly a controlling relationship can turn lethal. Advocates have returned to this case again and again, because it lays bare the most frightening truth about coercive relationships. It is tempting to believe that the women who die this way must have missed something, ignored a sign, failed to act. Karina is the answer to that comforting lie. She acted. She did everything the system asks a person to do. And it still was not enough to keep a man who had already decided how the morning would end 2 blocks and a few minutes away from her. Karina was not a woman who failed to see the danger or failed to act. She named it. She reported it. She went to the courthouse and got the order that is supposed to draw a line the law will defend. And a piece of paper, it turned out, could not stand between her and a man who had already decided how this would end. Her daughters were a few feet away the whole time, separated from the worst of it by a single wall, close enough to hear, too young to understand, old enough to spend the rest of their lives remembering that they had wanted their mom and she had not come. The older girl, grandmother told the court, still wakes in the night and cries for a mother who cannot answer. That is the shape. Grief takes in a child too young to have the words for it. A small body that keeps reaching for someone who is no longer there, long after the funeral and the verdict and the sentence have come and gone. The next case may be the most haunting on this entire list, because the child at its centre did not simply discover her mother. She tried to make sense of it with her own small voice, in real time, and then, only hours later, she became a victim herself. Still with me? Go ahead and subscribe before the next one. No cost, no catch, just keeps these investigations coming your way. Case 5. Chris Watts. She was 4 years old. That morning she walked into her parents' bedroom and found her mother on the bed, not moving. She asked what was wrong. She was told that Mommy did not feel good. And for the next few hours, this little girl trailed after her father, asking again and again the same impossible question. Watching things no child should ever see, until she finally asked him one last question that no parent should ever have to remember being asked. This is the rare and terrible case where the child who discovered the body became, only hours later, a victim herself. Father was Christopher Watts, 33 years old, an operations worker for an oil and gas company in Colorado. To everyone who knew them, the Watts family had looked like an ordinary suburban success story. He and Shanann had married in 2012 and built a life full of the usual milestones: 2 daughters, a 3rd child on the way, a son they had already chosen a name for. There was no criminal record, no history of violence anyone pointed to afterward. Nothing that would have marked him in a crowd. What there was, by the summer of 2018, was an affair with a co-worker, and a marriage he had quietly decided he wanted out of. There had been no warning the neighbours could point to afterward. No record, no visible violence, which is part of what makes the case so frightening. The danger inside that house had been completely invisible from the street, right up until the morning it consumed everyone inside it except the man who caused it. The victims were his entire family. His wife, Shanann, 34 years old, 15 weeks pregnant with the son they had named. She was, by every account of the people who knew her, engine of that household, energetic and devoted, building a life she narrated proudly to anyone who would listen. His daughter Bella, 4, the bright and watchful older sister, who would be the first to sense that something was wrong. And his daughter Celeste, who was 3. Shanann had come home, only in the small hours of that very morning, from a work trip, dropped off by a friend, 15 weeks along, and texting people about how glad she was to be back with her girls. She had no idea that the man waiting for her had already decided the marriage was over, and was not going to let it end the ordinary way. Ahast. By his own later account, Shanann had confronted him about the affair on the morning of the 13th of August 2018, told him he would never see his children again. And somewhere in that exchange, he made the decision that would end 4 lives, counting the baby she carried. In the family home in Frederick, Colorado, Chris Watts killed his pregnant wife in their bed. The son they had already named, the baby she carried, died with her. And that is when Bella walked in. She came in with her little blanket and saw her mother and asked what was wrong. What was wrong with Mommy? Father told her that Mommy did not feel good, letting the child believe Shanann was only sleeping. He began to move his wife's body. Bella followed him down the stairs, crying, asking that same question over and over again. He put both girls into the back seat of his truck with their mother and drove them out to a remote oil site owned by his employer. The girls riding in the back, asked him what he was doing to their mommy. What happened to those two little girls at that site is the part of this account that will not be described. It is enough, and it is already almost too much, to say that Chris Watts killed both of his daughters there and left them where he was, certain no one would ever find them. There is one detail that has haunted everyone who has ever learned about this case, and it comes from Watts himself. Bella, his 4-year-old, having already seen what happened to her little sister, looked at her father and asked him if the same thing was going to happen to her. And then, in her final moments, she begged him not to. She told him no. Watts later said that every single time he closes his eyes, he hears her voice. Few words are the reason this case sits on this list, and they are as far into that morning as this account is willing to go. What investigators would later piece together was not the work of a man who had lost control in a single instant. Cloud. He had taken careful steps to make it look as though his wife had simply walked out on the family. He even hid her wedding ring, so the story of a woman leaving of her own free will would hold together a little longer. Everything about the hours that followed had been arranged, managed, performed. Then Chris Watts went home and began to act out a lie. He went about his ordinary errands. He spoke to neighbours as though nothing were wrong. He leaned into a fence line and chatted the way he might on any other day. He even gave interviews to local television stations, standing in front of the cameras and pleading for his missing wife and daughters to come home, performing the role of a desperate, grieving husband and father, while he knew exactly where all three of them were. He moved through that day with a calm that would later horrify everyone who watched the footage back. A man running errands and facing cameras while his family lay where he had left them. The lie did not survive long, and the people who broke it open were the ones who loved Shannan most. A close friend had dropped Shannan at home in the small hours of that morning, just before 2, after the two of them returned from a work trip. When Shannan then missed an important prenatal appointment and could not be reached by anyone, that friend grew frightened, went to the house and insisted that police come and check while Shannan's car still sat in the garage. Responding officers' body camera footage of Watts during that welfare check became one of the first cracks in his story, because his demeanour and his shifting answers raised suspicion almost at once. There was something off in the way he carried himself, wrongness the camera caught, that the officer seemed to feel before he could name it, and it became the loose thread the entire case would eventually be pulled apart by. Federal agents and state investigators were drawn in within a day. Watts failed a polygraph. His own father sat across from him, and finally he gave a confession, beginning with the lie that Shannan had harmed their daughters, before he turned it back on himself. Co-worker at the centre of the affair went to the police on her own. The machinery of a full homicide investigation closed around him fast. He sat for a polygraph examination and failed it. His own father was brought in to face him across a table, and 3 days after the killings, searchers recovered all of them from the remote site where he had tried to make them disappear. On the 16th of August 2018, bodies of all 3 were recovered from the oil site. That November, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to multiple counts of first-degree murder, to the unlawful termination of his wife's pregnancy, and to tampering with the bodies under a deal that took the death penalty off the table at the request of Shannan's grieving parents, who said they did not want it. Host. There would be no trial, no weeks of testimony, because he had already admitted to every count. What was left was only the accounting, the long list read into a record that could never hold the size of what he had taken. On the 19th of November 2018, Frost, he was sentenced to 5 life terms without the possibility of parole. 3 of them ordered to run one after another, along with decades more for the remaining counts. The judge called it the most inhumane and vicious crime he had ever encountered in his career, and Watts was later transferred to a prison in another state for his own safety, where he remains to this day. Even from behind those prison walls, he remained a figure of grim public fascination, to the point that people signed petitions to stop him from being allowed to keep photographs of the very family he had destroyed inside his cell. The case became the subject of documentary, watched by millions around the world, the kind of story that pulls in viewers who have never met anyone involved and leaves them shaken for days. Streaming services built films around it. Strangers, who had never set foot in Colorado, came away unable to stop thinking about the family in those photographs. Shannon's family pursued and won a wrongful death judgment worth millions. A number that exists mostly as a measure of what cannot be measured: daughter, 2 granddaughters, and a grandson who never drew a breath. No figure a court can name reaches the bottom of a loss like that. It is the only language the law has for grief, and it falls short the way all of them do. But the detail that refuses to leave anyone who learns about this case is not the verdict or the sentence or the settlement. It is the picture of a 4-year-old following her father through the house that morning, clutching her blanket, asking the same gentle question again and again, because she could not yet imagine an answer terrible enough to fit what she was seeing. She had no framework for it. No child does. She simply trusted that the man she was trailing through the house would tell her the truth, and he told her instead that her mother was only sleeping. That small mercy of a lie is somehow the cruelest detail of all. Father, buying himself a few quiet minutes by telling his daughter the most ordinary bedtime untruth in the world. Nearly everything the public knows about. That final morning comes from a single 5-hour prison interview. Watts gave months later, which means even her last words reach us secondhand, spoken aloud by the very man she was begging. She did not survive to tell any of it herself. That fact sits underneath every retelling of this story like a stone. She is the only child on this list who was both the one who discovered a parent gone, and within hours a victim of the same hand. A horror of this case is not in its scale alone, but in how small and trusting the figure at its centre was, a little girl with a blanket who kept asking the same question because she still believed her father would answer it honestly. The next case returns to that same dreadful question of who finds the body, to a family torn apart by a discovery that none of them could ever have braced themselves for. Case 6. Alex Murdaugh. A phone call came late at night. A young man of 26 was asked by his own father if he was sitting down, and then he was told that his mother and his younger brother had both been killed. What that young man could not have known, as he raced home through the dark, was that the man gently breaking the news to him was the same man the state would soon accuse of doing it. This is the case where the discovery did not come from walking into a room and finding a body. It came from a voice on the telephone that may have been lying the entire time. The father was Alex Murdaugh, born in 1968, 4th-generation lawyer, from a family that had ruled the legal world of low country South Carolina for the better part of a century. For 3 generations, the men in his family had served as the top prosecutor for the region. Holding that office for the better part of a century, the name carried weight in those counties. It opened doors, settled disputes, bent rooms toward whoever was holding it, and behind that name, Alex Murdaugh was quietly coming apart. He was an admitted addict, dependent on opioids, and he was drowning in a sea of his own making. In Investigators would eventually accuse him of dozens of financial crimes, stealing roughly $12 million from his own clients over many years. Including from the family of the family housekeeper, who had died after a fall in the Murdaugh home. The money he was supposed to have secured for grieving families had vanished into his own accounts. Among the most damning of those alleged thefts was money tied to that housekeeper's death, settlement funds, meant for her grieving sons that prosecutors say he quietly funneled into his own pockets. It was the kind of betrayal that, once it began to surface, could not be contained. And the reckoning for all of it was bearing down on him in the very days his family died, and the walls were closing in. The state would later argue that the reckoning for all of it was about to arrive in the very same week that his wife's son died, that the man was staring down the total collapse of his career, his reputation and his freedom. Victims were the two people closest to him. His wife, Maggie, was 52 years old, a homemaker who had been married to Alex for nearly 30 years. Their younger son, Paul, was 22, a young man who was himself awaiting trial at the time, facing charges connected to a boat crash that had killed a 19-year-old. Family was already under a microscope, already living through scandal, already the subject of whispers across the region. Their older son, Buster, 26, and he was away from home when the night unfolded. On the 7th of June, 2021, a sprawling hunting estate of around 1,700 acres. In Islandton, in Colleton County, the family came apart in a single hour. Alex had called Maggie earlier and asked her to come out to the property, telling her they would travel together to visit his ailing father. Maggie texted a friend that her husband sounded strange to her, that he seemed like he was up to something. She drove out anyway, parked at the house, walked down to the dog kennels, where Paul was, and here is where the case turned, because Paul, minutes before he died, recorded a short video on his phone and posted it. In the background of that video, captured without anyone realizing it would matter, was a voice, Alex's voice. It placed him at the kennels at almost the exact moment the killings happened, in a spot he would swear up and down he had never been. For the investigators, that recording became the thread everything else hung from. Strip away the family name, the dynasty, the lawyers, and what was left was a man whose own voice put him at the scene of a double killing he claimed stumbled onto only later. Everything the defense tried to build had to get around those few seconds of background audio, and it never quite could. What happened next at those kennels was as brutal as anything those counties had ever seen. Manner of it is not something this account needs to lay out in detail. Both Maggie and Paul were killed there with firearms, weapons that were never recovered. The guns used that night were never found, which meant the case had to be built without the most obvious physical evidence of all, on voices and timelines and data, instead of on the weapons themselves. Later that night, Alex called for emergency help, telling the dispatcher he had just come home and found the two of them by the kennels. That it was bad that neither one of them was moving. His story was that he had been away the whole time, visiting his mother, who was living with dementia. But the data inside the phones in everyone's pockets, the timeline of calls and locations, and that one stray recording of his own voice, all told a different story than the one he was telling. For the family, the discovery belonged to Buster, and it came down a phone line. He would later describe it from a witness stand. His father had called him late and asked if he was sitting down, and then told him in an odd, flat way that his mother and his brother had been killed. Buster and his girlfriend drove out to the estate that night, and in a twist that makes this case sit so strangely against every other one on this list, Buster never turned against his father. He testified in Alex's defense. He said he believed his father was innocent, that he could not imagine the man being capable of harming Maggie or Paul. He has said publicly that he thought the trial his father got was not a fair one, and that the storm of pre-trial publicity had poisoned the well. Boy who got that phone call chose to believe the voice on the other end of it. The case against Alex was built on that recording at the kennels, on the phone and vehicle data that shredded his alibi, and on the work of the state's forensic specialists who connected the timeline together. There was also a recorded statement, made during an interview not long after the killings, in which Alex seemed to say something the two sides would argue about for months. The prosecution heard a man confessing. The defense insisted he had said something else entirely, that the words had been misread. Layered on top of all of it was the financial motive, testimony of former clients and bankers and accountants, establishing that his entire fraudulent empire was about to be exposed in the same days his family died. There was even a bizarre later chapter, a roadside scheme in which Alex arranged to be wounded in a staged roadside attack, so that Buster could collect a $10 million insurance payout, a plot that fell apart, and that he eventually admitted he had orchestrated. It was the kind of scheme that reads like fiction, a man so cornered that he tried to stage an attack on himself to leave his surviving son a fortune, and it only deepened the sense that the ground beneath him had given way entirely. The trial began in January of 2023 in the small town of Walterboro, and it became one of the longest and most watched proceedings in the history of the state, running roughly 6 weeks with around 70 witnesses. Alex took the stand in his own defense. On the 2nd of March 2023, fewer through than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty on all 4 counts. The following day, the judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms, and told Alex that the monster he had become while feeding his addiction may have been the thing that did this. It was a striking thing for a judge to say at a sentencing, an acknowledgement that the man in front of him had been 2 people at once. The respected attorney and the addict capable of something monstrous, that the law could only punish the one standing before it. But this case carries a turn that almost none of the others do, and it is recent. On the 13th of May 2026, the South Carolina Supreme Court threw the murder convictions out entirely. The ruling was unanimous, 5 justices to none, an unsigned opinion running 27 pages, and it landed like a thunderclap. The court found that the former clerk of court had tampered with the jury, writing that she had placed her fingers on the scales of justice, and in doing so had denied Alex Murdaugh his right to a fair trial before an impartial jury. The justices also held that the trial judge had allowed too much of the financial crimes evidence to come in. A new trial is now pending, and prosecutors have said they intend to try him again. So a case that once seemed closed, sealed by a swift guilty verdict, has been pried back open, and the family torn apart by that night now waits to learn whether a second jury will reach the same conclusion the first one did, or whether the truth of what happened at those kennels will slip away for good. Buster, for his part, tried to build something ordinary out of the wreckage, taking his share from the sale of the family estate and starting a life of his own, still holding to the belief that the father on the other end of that late night call could not have been the one who made the call necessary. He has not walked free. He remains locked up, serving a 40-year federal sentence and a concurrent 27-year state sentence for the financial crimes he admitted to, the theft that may have driven everything. By the time the convictions fell, the case had spilled far past any courtroom into books and streaming documentaries, and even a scripted television series, whole true crime industry, built on top of a family that had once seemed untouchable. None of it answered the only question that still matters, which is who killed Maggie and Paul, and whether the man their surviving son refuses to give up on will ever truly be made to answer for it. The clerk, at the centre of the reversal, pleaded guilty to a string of charges, among them misconduct in office and lying under oath, tied to her handling of the trial and to a book she had written about it. So the truth of that night sits, for now, unsettled. The son still believes his father. A court has said the verdict cannot stand, and somewhere underneath the legal machinery is the simplest fact of all, that a young man got a phone call from his father. And on the other end of that line was the death of his mother and his brother. He has spent every day since trying to decide what that voice was really telling him. The next case removes all of that doubt, because the child at its centre did not hear about the death secondhand. She was in the house awake, and she saw the person who did it. If these are the kinds of cases that crawl under your skin and stay there, do the simple thing and subscribe. It costs nothing, and it is the one signal that tells me to keep digging these up. Case 7. Thomas Clayton. She was 7 years old, and she woke in the dark to the sound of her mother screaming for her to run. So she ran, and she hid, and she lived. When a sheriff sat down beside her a few hours later and gently asked what she had seen, she described a man in a mask hurting her mother. And then she said something that did not make sense to anyone at first, because the mask, she told him, was one she had seen before, belonged to her own father. A child's account, given in the rawest hours after the worst night of her life, would become the single thread that unravelled the whole thing. The man at the centre of it was Thomas Clayton, former semi-professional hockey player and the husband of the woman who died. He had no real criminal history. What he had was a secret life, carrying on an affair, and he wanted out of his marriage. But he did not want to pay the price a divorce would cost him. The split of property, fight over the children. So he reached for the most cold and calculated solution a person can choose. He hired a former employee, a man named Michael Beard, and paid him $10,000 to make his wife disappear from his life permanently. Think about the arithmetic of that for a moment. A man weighed the cost of a divorce, the lawyers and the split assets, and the shared custody against the cost of a human life, and decided the cheaper option was to have the mother of his children killed for $10,000. That is the cold ground this entire case is built on. The victim was Kelly Stage Clayton, 35 years old, born in the summer of 1980. She had grown up in the Elmira area of New York, gone to school there, spent some years working out west before coming home. She had built the kind of steady, unremarkable life that never makes the news. A job, a marriage, 2 small children. The ordinary architecture of a family. None of it hinted that her own husband had already decided she was a problem, to be solved rather than a wife to be divorced. She had married Thomas, and built a family with him. They had 2 children, a daughter named Charlie, who was 7, and a younger son, still a toddler. From the outside it looked ordinary. Inside it, her husband was already arranging for her to be killed. On the evening of the 28th of September, 2015, Thomas did what he did every week. He went to his poker game, surrounding himself with witnesses, building himself an alibi, a calculated thing. The choice to be seen, to be surrounded by friends and cards, and the easy noise of a weekly game while, miles away, the man he had paid let himself into the house. A husband who simply wants a divorce does not arrange to be on camera in someone else's living room at the moment his wife dies. Around 10:50 that night, he borrowed a cell phone belonging to a friend's wife and used it to place a call to Michael Beard. Beard, by his partner's account, left his own home that night and came back a while later. That window, the length of his absence and the timing of it, would later line up with chilling precision against the borrowed phone call. And the moment Kelly died, a sequence that read like a schedule once investigators laid it out side by side. In that window, Beard let himself into the Clayton home in Catton near Painted Post. Kelly woke. She understood, in some instant way that mothers do, the danger in the house was not for her alone, and she screamed for Charlie to run. Charlie ran and hid. What was done to Kelly in that kitchen was violent, carried out with a long fiberglass handle, and the details of it add nothing here. Around midnight, Thomas came home from his game and called for emergency help, reporting a home invasion, but the scene did not read like a home invasion. There was no forced entry. Nothing had been taken. To investigators, 2 facts were the first cracks in the story. The first hints that whatever had happened here had come from inside the family's own life rather from a stranger in the night. Burglars take things. Intruders force their way in. Here there was nothing missing and no broken door. Only a woman killed in her own kitchen, and a husband with an airtight reason to have been somewhere else. The absence of a robbery was, in its own quiet way, the loudest piece of evidence in the house. And so the county sheriff sat down with the only witness who could tell him anything, a terrified 7-year-old, just hours after it happened. What Charlie told him is the heart of this case, she said. A man had been hurting her mummy, and that her mummy had been yelling for her to run. It is one of the most chilling sentences a child can ever speak, a small girl repeating the last instruction her mother ever gave her, an instruction that saved her life. Kelly's final act, in the worst moment of her own, was to make sure her daughter got away, she said. The man wore a mask and jeans. She said it could have been her dad, that he had looked like her dad. Asked how she could tell, she pointed to the mask, and said she had seen that mask before, on her father. And then she said the thing that reveals exactly how a small child's mind tries to protect itself from an unbearable truth. She said it could not really have been Daddy, because if it had been Daddy, then who would take care of them? She had reasoned her way around the horror, because the alternative was too large to hold. A grown adult might have screamed, or run, or frozen. This child had done something stranger and more heartbreaking. She had quietly negotiated with the facts, deciding the masked man could not be her father, because a world in which it was her father was a world she could not yet bring herself to live in. More formal interview followed at a child advocacy centre, conducted by specialists trained to speak with traumatized children. They were careful with her, deliberate, aware of how fragile a child's account can be and how much weight it can carry. What she gave them held up under every kind of scrutiny that followed. In the end, it became the centerpiece of the case, recording of a 7-year-old's first account, played aloud for the jury that would decide her father's fate, a small voice doing what no adult witness in that courtroom could. The sheriff would later say he saw no deceit in anything she told him. Whatever she said, it was true in her mind as she said it. That distinction mattered enormously, because a 7-year-old cannot be coached into the kind of fractured, self-protective logic Charlie had shown. The way she had built a wall around the idea that it was her father, and then explained that wall to herself out loud, she gave them, was not a memorized story. It was a child's mind caught in the act of trying to survive what it had just seen. The rest of the case fell into place from there. The borrowed phone call to Beard around 10:50 was in the records. Beard's own partner placed him away from home during the attack window. Beard, who had recently been evicted from a property by Thomas, brought in for questioning days later, and he confessed. He admitted he had been hired and paid $10,000. Police to the evidence he had discarded, including the handle used in the attack and clothing, and house keys tossed into a creek. Forensic work tied Kelly's own genetic material to the weapon. A third man, who had served as a lookout, was later arrested as well. What had looked, in the first hours, like a random and terrifying home invasion was revealed instead to be a planned operation with a paymaster, a hired hand, lookout. All of it set in motion by the one person a family is supposed to be able to trust without question, the husband and father, who had made sure to be somewhere else. Beard would stand trial first, in the fall of 2016, and although he tried to take his confession back on the stand, he was convicted and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Thomas Clayton's trial came in February of 2017, and it ran about 6 weeks. The centerpiece of it was Charlie's recorded interview. She did not have to take the stand and face the courtroom herself. Her words, spoken in those first raw hours, were played for the jury instead, allowed to carry their own weight without forcing a child to relive the night in front of strangers. It was a rare kindness extended to a witness who was also a victim, a way of letting the truth she had spoken stand on its own without dragging a small child back through the dark to say it all again. On the 24th of February 2017, Thomas Clayton was convicted and sentenced to life without parole, the same fate as the man he had hired. The hired man had tried, on the stand, to take his confession back, but the jury did not believe the recantation, and the structure of the plot, the payment, the timing, the discarded evidence, held firm against it. Charlie and her little brother went to live with their maternal aunt, who had become their guardian. They were raised away from the cameras. In the ordinary quiet their mother would have wanted for them, 2 children who had lost her to a plot hatched by the one person who was supposed to love her most. At Thomas's sentencing, that aunt read aloud a letter that Charlie had written entirely on her own. In it, the little girl said she loved her mom, that she loved her dad too, but that her dad was a coward, because he had made Michael Beard kill her mommy, child who had spent the night reasoning her way around the impossible had, in the end, understood it. She has been kept out of public view since, at her family's wish, growing up away from the cameras that turned her family's destruction into a television episode. The man who carried out the killing would later maintain his innocence to a national news program even after a jury had heard everything. But the verdicts held. 2 men who had conspired to erase a mother from her children's lives would both grow, old behind bars, and the 7-year-old who survived that night, the one whose few sentences to a sheriff had started the whole unravelling, be allowed to grow up in private. The next case reaches back across decades, to a child who was even younger and who was given no one to run from and no one to tell, only a silent house and a full day alone. Case 8. James Krauseneck. She was 3.5 years old, and one winter morning she woke in a house where something was terribly wrong. She's dressed herself badly, buttons lined up, crooked, more than one pair of socks pulled on in the wrong order. And then she waited, host. She was alone with her mother for the better part of an entire day. And when someone finally asked her what was in the house, she described a stranger, a bad man she could not explain, lying in her parents' bed. Her words were so confused, so impossible to parse. It would take investigators 40 years to understand what she had actually been trying to tell them. The father was James Krauseneck Jr., economist, who worked at a large film and camera company in Rochester, New York. He was around 30 years old at the time. He had no criminal record and the polished resume of a careful professional. But that resume held a lie. He had falsified his doctorate, claiming an academic credential he had never actually earned. And his employer had discovered the fraud only shortly before his wife died. Hard. For a man who had built an entire identity on being the credentialed expert, the careful economist with the advanced degree, having that lie exposed, threatened to take everything from him. At once, the job, the standing, the polished self he had presented to the world. The state would later argue that this was the pressure at the centre of everything, the unravelling of his fabricated credentials, and the strain it put on his marriage was the engine of the crime. The defence would point instead to a violent local offender who lived about a mile away, a man who, decades later and dying, would confess to the killing in writing, though his confession contained errors that led investigators to dismiss it. He got details wrong that the real killer would have known. And so, while the defence would wave that confession like a banner, people who had actually worked the case set it aside. It was, they came to believe, the false confession of a dying man, not the missing answer to a 40-year-old question. The victim was Kathleen Krauseneck, known as Kathy, 29 years old, originally from Michigan. She had met James back in high school, and the two had attended the same university. She had worked to support them during his graduate school years. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, a warm and steady presence, a young mother building a life in a new state, far from where she had grown up. She had tied her future to his, followed his career across the country, and was raising their little girl in the quiet Rochester suburb, where it would all end. They had one child together, a daughter named Sarah, who was 3.5. On the 19th of February 1982, in the Rochester suburb of Brighton, the story James told went like this. He said he had left for the office at around 6:30 in the morning, as he always did, and returned just before 5 in the evening to find a pane in the back door broken, glass scattered on the floor, and his wife in their bed upstairs, killed with a long-handled axe. He said he grabbed Sarah, who he claimed had been curled up safe in her own bed, ran to the neighbours. The way she had died is not something this account will set out in detail. By one account, the neighbour who opened the door described James as pale and shaken, unable to look away from his own house. What investigators would keep returning to was the scene itself, a house that bore every sign of a violent break-in, and yet was missing nothing at all. Real intruders do not leave the jewellery and the cash sitting out in plain view, and here both had been left completely untouched. The scene did not support the story of a break-in. Nothing had been stolen. Jewellery and money sat in plain view untouched. Broken glass struck investigators as wrong, as though the entry had been staged. And there was a footprint found inside, in a plastic bag at the scene, that was identified as coming from a boat shoe, the kind of shoe James himself owned. Police interviewed little Sarah at the neighbour's home, with a detective taking down what she said. Then, about a day after the killing, James left Rochester entirely, moved back to Michigan, and cut off contact with the police investigating his wife's death. For 33 years, the case went cold. Then, in 2015, the local police partnered with federal agents to reopen it. The modern re-examination pulled the old story apart. A renowned forensic pathologist concluded that Kathy had most likely died around 3:30 in the morning, hours before James said he left for work, which meant he would have been home at the time of the killing. There was no genetic trace of any intruder anywhere in the house. The staged burglary, the boat shoe print, his flight from the city, his refusal to speak to police, all of it was now read as the behaviour of a guilty man covering his tracks. Each piece on its own might have been explained away, a broken window, a stray footprint, a shattered man fleeing a house of horrors, stacked together and viewed through the lens of when she had actually died. They formed a portrait the cold case team found impossible to look past. In November of 2019, a grand jury indicted him, and he surrendered a week later. He had spent more than 3 decades living as a free man in another state, building a life far from the suburb where his wife had died. And then, all those years later, the past he thought he had outrun finally caught up with him. For 33 years the file had sat cold, kind of case investigators inherit and pass along, until a new generation of detectives and their federal partners decided to pull it apart more time, and found the answers had been sitting in the old evidence the whole while. Waiting for someone to read them correctly, he was tried in the late summer of 2022, and on the 26th of September that year, a jury convicted him. The trial leaned heavily on the work of the cold case re-investigation, and the court allowed testimony from witnesses who had since died to be read into the record over the objections of the defense, a measure of just how old and how stubborn this case had become. That November, the judge sentenced him to 25 years, to life, the maximum the law allowed, and said the crime was heinous and brutal and unimaginable, that he had lost no sleep over the verdict. But the law had a final strange twist waiting. In May of 2023, James Krausneck died in prison of cancer at the age of 71. Because his appeal was still pending when he died, his conviction was procedurally wiped from the record under a rule that applies in New York when a defendant dies before the appeal is resolved. Crucial to understand what that is and what it is not. It is a technical erasure, an abatement. It is not an exoneration. The jury's verdict was not overturned on its merits. The man simply died before the process finished, and the law treated the case as unresolved. For the family on the mother's side, who had waited 4 decades for a verdict, the erasure landed as a final cruelty. The conviction they had fought to win, wiped from the record on a technicality by the timing of a cancer. Kathy's relatives said bitterly that he was only sorry the man had died so soon, and hoped he was suffering wherever he had gone, and at the centre of it all, across all 40 years, is Sarah. As a child of 3.5, she had been left alone in that house, with her mother's body for somewhere around 10.5 hours. Written statement to police in 1982 was haunting and almost unreadable in its confusion. She described a bad man, possibly a woman, with no clothes and no glasses, lying in her parents' bed with an axe in their head. Asked whether the man was black or white, she answered that he was many colours. To anyone reading it cold, it sounds like the fragmented nonsense of a frightened toddler. To the investigators who came back to it 40 years later, it was something else entirely. The literal, uncomprehending description of a sight no child should ever have to look upon. The detective came to a devastating conclusion. Sarah had not seen any intruder. She had been describing her own mother's body, in a state too terrible for a small child to recognise as the person she loved. The prosecutor would tell the jury, decades later, that the bad man in Sarah's account had been her own father, and that what she had really seen was her mother, unrecognisable. It is almost too much to sit with. A 3-year-old left alone for the better part of a day with a sight her mind could not even file as a person, dressing herself in mismatched socks, waiting in a house gone silent, and then trying, in the only words she had, to describe the indescribable to a stranger. The detective who took that statement carried it for the rest of his own life. Sarah was raised by James after the murder, and she never wavered in believing him. She did not testify at his trial. Her only words in court came at his sentencing, where she spoke in his defence, saying she had been blessed with loving parents, and that both had now been taken from her, that her mother's killer had gotten away with it, and her father had been convicted of a crime he did not commit. She called the prosecution agenda-driven, and said she was appalled by the tactics of the police. James, for his part, addressed his daughter from the courtroom, saying his heart ached every day thinking of Sarah alone in that house, and that her mother was looking down from heaven, proud of her. An aunt on the mother's side, who saw the case very differently, still told Sarah across that same courtroom that she loved her no matter what. It was the one moment of grace in a hearing otherwise hollow out by grief and division, family broken into two camps by a single morning 4 decades gone, one side certain of his guilt, the other, led by the daughter he had raised, certain of his innocence, and a verdict that would dissolve before any of them could find peace in it. Family split clean down the middle by a single morning 40 years gone, grown woman still standing on the side of the father who had raised her. The next case is its mirror image in nearly every way, recent instead of decades old, a slow poisoning instead of a sudden blow, and children who did not defend the surviving parent at all. They begged the court to make sure she never came home. One small thing before we keep going. Subscribing is free and it takes about a second, and it is the single best way to make sure the next case finds its way to you. Case 9. Corey Richins. The children were asleep in the house the night their father died. Their mother would tell investigators that she had been in one of the boys' rooms, comforting a son through a nightmare, and that she came back to bed and found her husband cold beside her. A few months later, she published a children's picture book about helping a young child cope with the loss of a parent, and she read it aloud on a morning television show with a soft, practiced smile. The boys who were in that house would one day stand in a courtroom through the voices of others and tell the world a very different story about the woman who wrote it. The mother was Corey Richins, 32 at the time, a real estate agent and a mother of 3 sons. For years she had been carrying on an affair. She had a boyfriend she was unwilling to give up, and a husband whose money and life insurance were worth far more to her gone than alive. The motive, investigators finally assembled it, was as old and as ugly as any on record, another person and a payout. And for years, investigators would later say, she had been quietly defrauding her own husband, forging his name on documents, taking money from his business, and arranging life insurance policies he did not know existed. After his death, she wrote and self-published a gentle children's book she called Are You With Me? And she promoted it as a tool for grieving families, appearing on a local lifestyle program to talk about loss, all before her arrest in May of 2023. It is hard to overstate the audacity of it. While investigators were quietly building a homicide case against her, she was casting herself in public as the brave widow, the mother holding her grieving boys together and turning her husband's death into a product she could sell. The book was not a footnote to the crime. To many who followed the case, it was the crime's most chilling extension, a killer monetizing the grief she had manufactured. The victim was her husband, Eric Richins, 39 years old, the owner of a successful masonry business in the Karmaz area of Utah. He was the father of those 3 boys. By a cruel arithmetic, he would have turned 44 on the 13th of May, 2026, which is the exact day his wife was eventually sentenced for killing him. He had been, by every account, a hard-working and devoted father, a man who had built a real business with his hands, and who doted on his 3 boys. He was also, in the last stretch of his life, a man who had begun to suspect that the person sleeping beside him wanted him gone, and who had quietly taken legal steps to shield his sons and his estate from her. The warning signs, in hindsight, stretched back years. On a trip to Greece in 2019, Eric had fallen ill after drinking something his wife had served him, and the family would later wonder if it had been a first attempt. In the autumn of 2020, Eric quietly consulted a divorce attorney and an estate lawyer, and set up a trust that placed his estate under the control of his sister if he died, which suggests a man who had begun to fear his own home. People do not quietly rewrite their estate and hand control to a sibling unless something gone deeply wrong in a marriage. Eric was building a wall around his children and his money, and he was building it against the woman he had married. That instinct, tragically, turned out to be exactly right. On Valentine's Day of 2022, Eric ate a sandwich his wife had made him, and told 2 friends afterward that he felt like he was going to die. He survived that one too. Prosecutors would later treat it as another attempt on his life. Around that same time, Corey asked her housekeeper to help her get hold of pills, and the housekeeper testified that she had bought illicit drugs for her. The dealer she named denied selling what was claimed, but the through line was unmistakable. A wife actively seeking out the means to kill, asking the people around her to help her acquire it, leaving behind a trail of requests that would later read like a rehearsal. On the night of the 3rd of March 2022, at their home near Park City, Eric and Corey shared a drink to celebrate a real estate deal. Corey said she then went to sleep in one of her son's rooms because the boy was having nightmares. In the early hours of the next morning, she said, she returned to the bedroom and found Eric unresponsive and called for help. The autopsy told a story her account could not survive. Eric had died from a lethal dose of a potent narcotic taken by mouth, roughly 5 times the amount it takes to kill a person, slipped to him to swallow. This was not a man who had simply died in his sleep. This was a poisoning, and it was not a desperate, spur-of-the-moment act. By the time that final dose was given, there had already been a suspected attempt overseas and a near miss with a meal on Valentine's Day. This was a campaign, carried out with patience, against a man who had told his own friends he feared he would not survive his wife's cooking. A little over a year later, with her book on shelves and her grieving widow image carefully built, Corey Richins was arrested and charged with aggravated murder. Her trial ran about 3 weeks across the early months of 2026. Defendant arrested without calling a single witness, and she chose not to testify. On the 16th of March 2026, after only about 3 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted her on every count: the aggravated murder and attempted murder for the earlier poisoning, and counts of insurance fraud and forgery. On the 13th of May 2026, on what would have been Eric's birthday, the judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, telling the court that a person who would do this, in this way, for these reasons, was simply too dangerous to ever be free. The jury had not taken long. After only a matter of hours, following weeks of testimony, a panel of 8 came back with guilty verdicts on every count, and its foreperson would later say they had walked into the deliberation room already, grasping the weight of what they had heard. The discovery and the heart of this case belongs to the 3 boys who were in that house. They did not take the stand. Their words were read aloud at the sentencing by counsellors who spoke for them, and those words gutted the room. One son recalled that on the night his father died, he had been put to bed early, without his usual bath, which was strange in their family, and that when he tried to go into his parents' room, his mother yelled at him to go away. It was a small boy's memory of an ordinary night turned wrong, the disrupted routine, the closed door, the sharpness in his mother's voice, kind of detail a child does not invent and does not forget. He said plainly that she had not slept in his room that night at all, directly contradicting the story she had told investigators. Another son said his mother had only ever cared about herself and her boyfriends. He would not feel safe if she were ever released. A third accused of killing nearly all of his animals and said he believed she may have tried to poison him too after he suffered a seizure. The oldest, who was 13, said he was afraid that if she got out she would come after him and his brothers and his whole family, that she would take them and hurt them, and that while he missed his father, he did not miss the life they used to live, and he did not miss her at all. Their aunt, who, along with her husband, had taken custody of the boys, told the court that they were not props for some twisted children's book about grief and loss, and yet that was exactly what their mother had reduced them to. It was perhaps the truest thing said in the entire proceeding. 3 living children had been turned into characters in a marketing campaign by the same woman who had taken their father, and that the gentle little book about loss had been written by the very person who caused it. She had even read it aloud on television, smiling softly, playing the grieving mother, teaching her sons to cope, while those same sons were quietly carrying the truth she believed she had buried with their father. Corey, given the chance to speak, told her sons she had never abandoned them, that she would never leave them, that she was sorry if even for a second they had thought she did. It was a remarkable performance to the very end. A woman convicted of poisoning the boy's father telling those same boys that her only concern had ever been them. Not one of them, in the statements read on their behalf, gave any sign of believing her. The evidence had buried her long before she opened her mouth. The autopsy contradicted her account outright. Texts and calls had been deleted from her phone during the very window her husband was dying. Her search history was a confession in itself. Queries about what a lethal dose looks like, about what poisoning is recorded as on a death certificate, about prisons for women. Taken together, those searches were not the idle curiosity of a frightened wife. They were the research of someone planning a death and weighing the consequences of having caused it, typed into a phone in the weeks before her husband stopped breathing. There was the documented Valentine's Day episode, and Eric's own stated belief, shared with his family before he died, that his wife was trying to kill him. That is a haunting thing to leave behind. A man telling the people who loved him that he believed his own wife wanted him gone, and then dying in exactly the way he had feared. His warning became, in the end, the most human piece of evidence the prosecution had. There was the housekeeper's testimony, forged insurance applications, and the friends who recounted Eric saying he felt he might die after that sandwich. The judge, in sentencing her, noted a gap in the state's law that prevented him from issuing a lasting order to keep her from contacting her sons, and urged lawmakers to close it. So this is a parent who planned for months, who hid her tracks, who wrote a book to launder her image, while her own children quietly assembled the truth on their own. Final case on this list has no such elaborate scheme behind it. It is brutal and it is fast, and at its centre is the youngest child of all, a little girl barely 2 years old, found standing in a quiet house beside the only parent she had, for hours with no one coming. Case 10. Adam Lawless. She was 2 years old, and when help finally arrived, she was standing in the house beside her mother, physically unharmed, simply waiting. By the time anyone came, she had been alone with what had happened for the better part of a day. She was far too young to understand it, far too young to call for help, far too young to do anything at all, but wait in a silent house for someone to walk through the door, and the person who finally did was the father of the man who had caused it. The man was Adam Lawless, 28 years old, from the small town of Ivor, South Carolina. He was the boyfriend of the woman who died, and he owned the home where she lived. That ownership matters because it made the house his, the locked door his, the control of who came and went his. The woman who died lived there on his terms, a home she did not own, with a man whose name was on the lease and whose temper, it would turn out, was the most dangerous thing in it. Defense would be that he had been at work when it happened. Alongside him, a 19-year-old named Aaron Kenyon was charged as an accessory after the fact, accused of helping cover the crime along with a drug charge. The victim was Tabitha Nicole Duncan, 24 years old, a young mother who lived with Lawless. She is survived by her daughter, 2 at the time, and who was inside the home unharmed throughout. Beyond that, the public record keeps her life private, as it should. She was somebody's daughter and somebody's mother. A young woman of 24 with a small child and a life still mostly ahead of her. And the case that bears her name is, like the others, told mostly through the machinery of courts and coroners and arrest reports, because the people who loved her have chosen, understandably, to grieve her out of the glare. What is known for certain is that she did not get to watch her daughter grow, and that her daughter will not remember her, and that both of those facts trace back to a single violent night in a house that should have been a refuge. In the early hours of the 12th of March 2018, in the home on East Broad Street, an argument turned deadly. Adam Lawless killed Tabitha that night, in a way the county coroner would later describe as both violent and deliberate. The specifics of it serve no purpose here. What the evidence would establish is that this was no accident and no stranger's crime. It happened after an argument behind a locked door in a home the two of them shared, and it was the kind of violence that leaves little room for doubt about intent. The coroner's findings spoke to a death that was both brutal and deliberate. The coroner would estimate that she had been gone for somewhere between 8 and 12 hours by the time she was found. Try to picture the scale of that against the size of the child it happened to. Not a teenager who could call for help, not a school-age child who could run to a neighbour, but a 2-year-old, an age when the whole world is still just the few rooms of home and the parent inside them. For most of a day, her entire world was a house gone quiet and a mother who would not wake. Around 2 o'clock that afternoon, Adam's own father, James Lawless, came to the house to check on Tabitha after she could not be reached. He broke a glass pane to get inside. He had no idea what he was walking into. He had come on the smallest of errands to check on someone who had not answered, and instead he became the person who found her, and the person who found the child waiting beside her. In a single afternoon, he went from a worried visitor to a witness to the worst thing his own family had ever done. And there he found Tabitha, and he found her 2-year-old daughter standing nearby, alive and unhurt, having been in that home beside her mother for all those hours, called for emergency help. By the time he made that call, the better part of a day had already slipped by. His son had left the scene and gone about his hours, as though nothing had happened, leaving a small child alone with the aftermath, trusting, perhaps, that the silence would hold long enough. No one who could have helped had any reason to think anything was wrong until a worried father broke a window to get inside. The discovery preserved the scene, and the toddler's survival is the small, fragile mercy buried in the middle of an otherwise merciless story. She had not been harmed. Whatever rage had filled that house in the early hours had not reached her, and she had simply been left, the way you might leave a child in a room while you stepped out. Except that the person who stepped out was never coming back. The one who remained could not answer her. That she lived is the only thing in this account that resembles good news, and even that is wrapped in something unbearable. 4 days later, the state's law enforcement division, working at the request of the local police, arrested Adam Lawless on a charge of murder, along with charges for possessing as a weapon, with its serial number scratched away, and for drugs. He was denied bond. Kenyon was arrested the same day on the accessory charge. His role, as investigators described it, came not in the killing itself, but in what happened afterward in the effort to cloud the trail. Paired with a drug charge, placed him in the case as a man accused of helping a killer in the hours that followed, rather than a man who had tried to stop one. The case against Lawless was strong. His claim that he had left the home early that morning, at around 6:30, and had not seen Tabitha since, contradicted by the physical evidence and the timeline of when she had died. His co-defendant had given false information to investigators, which supported the theory of an effort to cover the crime after the fact. It says a great deal about that night, that in the hours after Tabitha died, the energy in motion was not toward getting her help or getting her child to safety, but toward hiding what had been done. Weapon with an obliterated serial number was recovered. The scratched-off serial told its own small story. Weapon someone had wanted to make untraceable, pulled from a case that was anything but. Around it, the physical evidence and the coroner's timeline built a wall the defense could not climb. And the jury would eventually agree that the man who lived in that house, and not some passing stranger, the one responsible for what happened inside it. There had been no break-in, nothing taken, no sign that anyone from outside had ever come through the door. The danger had been inside that home all along, the way it so often is in the cases that end up on a list like this one. In April of 2023, a jury convicted Adam Lawless, and the judge sentenced him to 30 years. The mandatory minimum the law sets for murder, intended to be served in full. There was no plea deal, no reduced charge, just a trial and a verdict 5 years after the night it happened. The prosecutors who handled it, the lead solicitor and his senior assistant, had built the case patiently across those years, and when it was done, the solicitor spoke about how rare and how terrible it is to prosecute a killing carried out where a child would be the one left behind. The lead prosecutor, after the conviction, called it a horrific murder committed in the presence of a child, praised the jury for holding the man accountable. Accountability in a case like this is a strange and partial thing. It cannot reach back and change the day. It cannot give a little girl back the mother she will never remember. All it can do is name what happened as a crime, and set a number of years against it, which is at once everything the law can offer and nowhere near enough. His defence filed notice that they would appeal, and so the legal chapter of it grinds on, the way these things do, long after the headlines have faded. For the family left behind, no verdict was ever going to undo anything. Tabitha was a 24-year-old mother, and whatever she might have become, whatever ordinary years she might have had with her daughter, ended in a house on an ordinary street, in a town few outsiders will ever have any reason to visit. There was no documentary, no streaming series, no national outrage, just a local headline or two, a trial that came and went, and a small girl placed quietly with family, growing up far from anyone who knows what her first years held. The little girl, the youngest discoverer on this entire list, was placed with family and is a child of around 10 now. Her name and her placement have been kept private, as they should be. Local news covered the case, and then the world moved on, the way it does with the cases that do not become documentaries, the ones that happen in small towns to people whose names the rest of us will never learn. But it happened to her all the same. She will most likely grow up with no memory of that day, and that may be the only kindness in any of this. There is a cruel symmetry in it. The older children on this list will carry vivid, specific memories, a phone call, a masked figure, a body in a bed, poisoned father, for the rest of their lives. The youngest will carry something stranger, an absence she cannot picture, a day she cannot recall, a loss that shaped the entire course of her life. Before she had the words to know it was happening, Crot. Yet the fact of it remains underneath whatever life she builds. She was left in a house with a parent who was gone, and she was made to wait, and in some quiet way she will carry it, remembered or not, the same as every child whose story came before hers. That is the thread that ties all 10 of them together. Across decades and oceans and circumstances that could not look more different from one another, a wealthy lawyer's estate and a small rented home in a tiny town, a nation's most watched trial and a case that barely left the local paper, poisoning planned for years and a killing that took minutes. Strip away every difference, and the same child stands at the centre of each one, the one who walked in or woke up or got the call or was simply left behind, and learned that the person who was supposed to keep them safe was gone, and that they would be the one to carry it. 10 children, 10 homes that were supposed to be the safest places in the world and were not. Each of them came face to face with the loss of a parent, one person meant to protect them, and each was left to carry that discovery for the rest of their lives. If their stories meant something to you, subscribe so the next investigation finds you, and we will see you on the next case.